Hello, and it is late today in the evening. I think it's past 12 in India, and it's Wednesday, the 6th of July. Over the past few days, I have been trying to put together a body of criticism on the idea of communism conference series. Now, to those of you who might be unaware, this was a set of conferences held by the publisher Verso. The first one was in London, and then there was, of course, a recognized second one, an official one in New York, and the third in Seoul. These were in the years 2009 or between 2008 and 2012. Now, in my past couple of videos, I took up a few papers that were presented in the first conference by Alessandro Russo and by Bruno Bostiles. You will find them on my channel, and you're most welcome to have a look. Yet this is this is the first paper that I'm taking up from the second conference, and there's something to be said about that, and I mean regarding the nomenclature itself, regarding it being the second conference, but we'll get to that in a moment. So to begin, a paper from the second Idea of Communism conference, second as counted by the publisher Verso, which incidentally has its headquarters in London and New York, does catch my eye. This paper is titled A Communist Ethics. Before I get into it, however, I should make clear that in actuality this would have been the third conference, following the first organized by Birkbeck in London. The uncounted second conference, of which we only catch reference of in some of these papers, took place in Berlin. A volume comprising of the details of that event does not seem to be forthcoming. And while that does not seem to introduce the paper I have mentioned, there is a reason why I said it catches my eye. In the typeface, the U in communist is removed, as it were, floating above the word and out of axis. An empty space can hence be discerned in the title with the letter O replacing it, forming the word communist. The question raised by Susan Buck-Morss, however, even among communists, is hardly a common one, even if it provokes a response, framing, as it were, any possible comprehension of the term. I already am at a loss here, perhaps because of my own unconscious predisposition to begin with an inquiry, for the author does not begin her essay with a question, but a declaration, as axiomatic in delivery as it is absurd in my apprehension. Quote, "Politics is not an ontology." A provocative beginning, indeed, yet a provocation here which seems to serve as a covering. For as the author explains, what such a founding axiom actually means is that the ontological is never political. What is happening here? In the subtext, there is a not so minor game of not as much the determinacy of the negation in question, or at least not yet, but rather where is its remainder. We may write this in propositional form as such. 1. Not all politics is an ontology. 2. Not all ontology is political. Now, these are propositions which, while suggested by the initial declaration, do have histories behind them. Conceptual histories which have been appraised by certain thinkers in the past, of which perhaps I should mention the name Walter Benjamin here. But as I state, without developing this point, however, let us note that the author, Susan Buck Morss, spots a precedent. Adorno, whose work is interpreted as a demonstration of the failure of an attempt to ground a philosophy of being with a capital B, starting from the given world. A student of philosophy, well, read that. It is a dense topic. Without developing this point regarding the mutual not allness of politics and ontology, and the implication of where is the remainder, Susan Buck Morss spots a precedent. Adorno, whose work is interpreted as a demonstration of the failure of an attempt to ground a philosophy of being, starting from the given world. This is the important part. A student of philosophy would recognize the taste for nostalgia and even an epic past that any such attempt may find itself foreclosed to. An attempt that is, which would deify the world as it is in attempting to derive or even define ideals. A footnote represents some of the author's own thinking. Quote, "For a post-metaphysical ontology, essence cannot be a transcendent category, but must remain immanent to existence." End of quote. I must express my own unfamiliarity with the oeuvre of the author's work. However, there is the argument that a post-metaphysical ontology, whatever that may be, would recognize essence in the appearance as appearance. When a recognition opens up the conceptual displacements via which we understand how that which is given integrates with a worldview, so to speak. And in this sense, perhaps the appearance of essence may still be thought of as transcendent in a sense. Let me repeat this. The argument that a post-metaphysical ontology, whatever that may be, would recognize essence in the appearance as appearance. When a recognition opens up the conceptual displacements via which we understand how that which is given integrates with a worldview, so to speak. And in this sense, perhaps the appearance of essence may still be thought of as transcendent, in a sense. Here, I cannot but broach such a point without a moment of recollection, a recollection, as it were, which cannot be cited, as we presently don't seem to have a public record of it. Yet it represents for any still with us what sort of problems emerge when we begin to start thinking possible temporalities, dare we use the singular, for our ontology. The author insists that were the character of being to be conceptually grasped, this is in quotes, we would not be able to return to the material world, grasping its diversity with some philosophical intuition, as it were. So allow me to present the case for an appearance whose character we have been unable to grasp, a character yet alluded to, or rather deployed, in this text, yet whose appearance has not, as of today, the 5th of July 2022, been facilitated by the mode of production into that simple term we call a commodity. You may notice that I present a call not as much for a character, though they may be welcome, as much for a text. And this does bring us back to the question of the remainder. Quote, a perception of historical reality, not as a positive order, but as a non-all, an incomplete texture which tends towards its own future. It is this inclusion of the future into the present, its inclusion as a rupture within the order of the present, which makes the present an ontologically incomplete non-all, and thus pulverizes the evolutionary self-deployment of the process of historical development. In short, it is this rupture which distinguishes historicity proper from historicism. End of quote. This is a quote presented in a paper at the same conference, The Idea of Communism 2, New York. It cites a conference, however, that took place in Berlin, 2010, a year after the first in London, and a year before the one where the paper before our consideration in the collection, The Idea of Communism 2, is. Why do I wish to examine this paper? The immediate, even reactionary answer is simply that the commensurability of ontology to change in historical time presents itself in the form of a narrative. The narrative as a form here is privileged in its unique ability to represent not merely experience, but the form of subjection, breaks, rhythms, and other such marks which come to inscribe time. That is, especially when there is a directed and purposeful act being undertaken. Ironically, it is ultimately these markers, these signs, if you will, that make another's experience commensurable to us, and not the experience itself, even if we may have shared it. This is how an other represents what they mean for us. It is difficult to emphasize the importance of this last sentence. The author herself, in realizing the out-of-jointness or contradiction in the argument, does go on to cite Marx as a possible exception, who in his early work, commonly known as the Economic and Philosophic Manuscripts, 1844, actually seems to explicate a social ontology which nudges towards a moment of revolution. For our purposes, however, let us return to the quote presented by Althusser's student, Baudelaire, at the end. Even if we are returning not to the quote itself, but its corresponding footnote. Quote, Incidentally, this formulation is not incompatible at all with much of what Negri, with whom Zizek has a fundamental philosophical disagreement, which I return to in a minute, writes on the issue of historical time. Indeed, both authors are continuing a line once opened by Ernst Bloch. This is the footnote, and let me just reread the quote again, just to refresh your memory. A perception of historical reality, not as a positive order, but as a non-all, an incomplete texture, which tends towards its own future. It is this inclusion of the future into the present, its inclusion as a rupture within the order of the present, which makes the present an ontologically incomplete non-all, and thus pulverizes the evolutionary self-deployment of the process of historical development. In short, it is this rupture which distinguishes historicity proper from historicism. The footnote tries to bring to our notice a certain kind of similarity that such a position seems to be presenting for Etienne Balibar between two, let us call them communist thinkers or critics, who actually in their work don't seem to have very much in common. And in fact, this is what is going to animate some of Balibar's considerations, who would like to place Negri and Zizek on opposing sides of an aisle. This is what I try and present further. This is a sentence of some import, for if what we are in some ways coming to terms with today, which let us call a communism open to the common, then really what we are still talking about is our relationship to our labor and the ownership of commodities. Zizek, the Hegelian, sees in the products of our labor aspects which influence our distinctly philosophical, aesthetic, scientific, and amorous capacities. Negri, however, would choose to rather not use an article to mediate relations, as a mass-produced artifact is not conceptually capable of representing the anomalous configurations of the multitude, whose time is enslaved and domesticated, as it were, in their production. This difference in methodologies, however, between Zizek and Negri may call for a closer examination, which is why I propose a reading of Balibar's paper as company to the conference, where he takes up precisely this issue. Balibar's paraphrasing of this debate is represented by him in the terms which each side would focus on: ideology in the case of Zizek, and productive forces for Hart and Negri. Reductive yet still representative of the kinds of inflections at stake, even if we are referring to not a particularly engaged perspective. Further, if each of these were to be thought as incomplete sets, as Badiou reminds us that any collection, indeed any sets, are, then in terms of representing what lies unsaid in these categories, which may strengthen either's case inasmuch as it may enunciate a genuine revolutionary Marxism. Balibar's account here cannot hope to be comprehensive, as this is at least not the explicit aim of his paper. Also, in his Balibar's account of Heart and Degree, reading Marx without the emphasis on the Hegelian element of dialectical synthesis, we are left with an interpretation which would portray him as an individual mediating class relations with plainly political interests of supersedence. In other words, a modernist Machiavelli, a reading which, in whose mediatory moment at least, his contemporary, colleague, and once collaborator, Pierre Macquarie, may be more compelling. I shall leave this as it stands here without splitting hairs amidst our fellow Althusserians. Similarly, in depicting Zizek's argument as compromised because of a dependence on sublime terror, perhaps prior to the state itself, what the philosopher here ignores is that the moment of irrationality or fixation is actually identified by our Lacanian at the level of the psyche, before its manifestation of any superstructural violence, whose telling symptoms, I might add, Zizek does much to point out in cultural discourse prior to any riot on the streets. Balibar also reads further into the history of operaismo or workerism, tendencies which may not be unfamiliar to many of us in the developing world today, such as the confrontation between the technical and organic composition of labor. A confrontation which I will remind any budding workerists was very much alive in Marx, even if they were not already subsumed into classes. For Marx actually read these as tendencies, the confrontation between the organic and the technical component of, or rather the composition of labor. For Marx actually read these as tendencies operating in the mode of production itself, as components whose composition yielded the nature in which surplus value is extracted from an enterprise. In returning to Susan Buckmore's proposition, I would like to present that Marxism, which I would present as a distinctly communist tendency within the labor movement, inasmuch as it examines the mode of production to be the site of politics, has always been ontological. Having presented this modest rejoinder, I would accede to the author's claim that this ontological tendency, perhaps expressed in the early Marx, which the author does provide an autobiographical excerpt from, does not by itself provide a political orientation. Towards this end, I presume, the author does champion forms of reportage operational today, made possible by handheld cellular devices. The medium of the first-person eyewitness report becoming transmissible globally has allowed masses of demonstrators to mobilize and even cover events that were crucial in the overthrow of regimes deemed to be repressive. Arab Spring will be remembered for this, as indeed will the years 2009 to 2011, which witnessed riots in Athens and London, Anna Hazare's hunger strike, and Occupy Wall Street. Movements whose narratives were put together, constellating something of a historical background to these conferences we have been reviewing. For a theorist like Susan Buck-Morss, these events indicate the validity of a Marxist diagnosis and critique of capitalism, just as they point out live developments which earlier developments in its name have not scrutinized, seemingly an argument against revisionism. Let me just repeat the last sentence. For a theorist like Susan Buck-Morss, these events indicate the validity of a Marxist diagnosis and critique of capitalism, just as they point out live developments which earlier developments in its name have not scrutinized. I should have perhaps written other movements in its name. Seemingly an argument against revisionism. Now, I must state that this is hardly the entirety of the paper that Susan Buck-Morss presented, and I think she does actually try and foreground certain tendencies as to how the configurations of space and reading publics and the relations between the local and the translocal and the global are understood within her own circles. And I think this would constitute somewhat of the middle of the essay. And I would, of course, welcome you to go and read some of those sections if you are interested. She also, for exception, notices that, or rather does take note of Assange and what WikiLeaks is, and why, irrespective of what his personal motives were for those actions, it does in effect democratize the control of the internet, which is in fact a theme that she does touch upon. And it is not something that will be or is even today presently for many of us irrelevant. If you remember, China has actually banned Google from operating on its territory, and I think its headquarters, the Chinese headquarters of Google, was forced to move to Hong Kong. And I think even the government here in India has banned a very large number of sites. And of course, there are censor boards and there are other considerations which are taken into account when these decisions are made. Yet, in effect, it means that there is a committee behind closed doors whose criteria of scrutiny is in no way presented to you, that will, or are rather are, making decisions about what you can or cannot do at home, sitting wherever you may be. Yet, of course, those pragmatics are not delved upon. What I did appreciate about this essay, however, is that it tries to, in some ways, open up an element which I think very many vulgar critiques of capitalism, and I do mean this in the most literal sense, will, or rather very many workerist critiques of capitalism, which may emphasize a criticism of its institution from a class basis based upon the position that a worker may be occupying, tend to ignore. And that is the, of course, effect of their labor for that institution and what that would mean in terms of mediating their relations in that place. And this is, of course, the tendency which I try to point out that differentiates a perspective such as Zizek, who may, for instance, try and glean the expressive dimensions of cultural commodities, not necessarily high culture, though that would of course not be excluded, but even something as mundane as a can of Coke or a cup of coffee or literally even a commode, and what that represents or means for the cultures that have literally universalized their usage of these artifacts. And of course, I think this is a well, if you will, a style of criticism, or rather a abolition of the earlier canonical or classical tendency to divide what was recognized to be low bro or high bro culture in another epoch or period, which was perhaps more in line with a understanding of estates and classes, and of course other modes of hierarchy which are uh, reproduced and established and things of that kind. Which is not to say that Negri is in any way complicit with this. It's just that for his own purposes, and from the little bit that I have read of him so far, which is really not very much, he would choose to treat um, the individual's relation to a social nexus as almost like a soup of institutions that someone may pick and choose from in terms of how it is that they may locate their own associations or commitments to. And in this sense, a choice that is a live potency that he would like to invoke and perhaps offer to his quote unquote multitude, which perhaps at some point must be said is not entirely dissimilar from what was or is traditionally known to be as a constituency for a politician. Even, of course, Negri is against the parliamentary process and, of course, does live up to his word. There are other points that I think are important, um, particularly regarding the commensurability of experience whenever a question of how ontological change um, becomes imminent to time. Now, what does this mean? And at this point, I would have to directly address the question of what an ontology is. Well, the simple way that I have of explaining it to myself would be to try and think of the relation between heterogeneous elements. And by heterogeneous elements, I don't necessarily mean chemicals. Let me put it like this. You may have a set of fruits in a bowl, and you will always be able to call them a set of fruits in a bowl. If I were to, however, remove two of the fruits and add one vegetable and a shaker of salt, that is no longer a set of fruits in a bowl. It may be addressed as a collection of common articles that you might find on a table, but it does unfamiliarize what you're looking at in a sense. The point here is not the unfamiliarity. The point here is to recognize what the relationships between those objects are for yourself. In other words, it is a question of how you recognize these objects, but it is never merely a question of recognition, because the only way you recognize these objects is in terms of your associations with them, what you do with them, what you don't do with them, and that is, of course, determined by the object itself. Now, in a mode of production, we are entailed, or rather complicit, or rather often responsible for actually accounting for, providing, or servicing, or reviewing, or banning, or promoting many such objects. And often we are not referring to objects in themselves, we are referring to associations, advertisements, stories, people, relationships, feelings, and things of that kind as well. Now, these states or these references or these associations become meaningful to a person when you can relate your own experience to them for another in a way that is still comprehensible. And in such a situation, I think the form of a narrative is still the privileged medium, which in common human parlance still comes across as being able to refer to or transmit what a sense of a person's life or relations in a certain situation might be for someone who was not or did not share that um, experience and so on. This, I think, is a question which I think, or rather, which Lukács, I think, most concretely amongst the later Marxists does take up. And I would always recommend that you, if it interests you, read a little bit of him. Now, I don't want to linger on this essay. It is already late at night. It's past 1. And if I've kept you up, I do apologize. Hopefully, I've not roused any neighbors. Bye bye for now. Good night. And yes, I will leave the text in the description. And as always, I invite your commentary, criticism, or of course, suggestions, revisions if you would think some are called for. Bye bye.